You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Hello and welcome. I'm trying to live stream for the Foreign Policy Focus podcast patrons. I got Will Porter on the line with me and one of my patrons. I don't know if you guys want to both introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, sure. I'll introduce myself. I'm Will Porter. I come on to Foreign Policy Focus pretty often to talk and commentate about world affairs and stuff. I'm a staff writer at RT, and I write for a bunch of other places: Libertarian Institute, Antiwar.com, Consortium News, etc. So, hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Woskow. I do a little bit of blogging at the Libertarian Institute and follow Kyle and Will on Scott's Reddit group and Patreon.
Oh, awesome. This is exciting. I didn't realize you were one of my patrons. So, yeah. Find Steven on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. I don't know, 1 or 2 posts a day usually.
A couple, yeah. It depends if other people are posting, I lay off, but especially if Scott's active, I think most people want to hear what he has to say.
But today, we've had some big news actually. Well, I guess not actually. It's pretty frequent now on the Iran front with a U.S. Global Hawk drone being shot down. And of course, this has been made a big to-do by the Hawks in the Trump administration, saying that, the Iranians shot our drone down in international water, an international airspace. Some of the Hawks calling for a military strike in response. And Will, I know you covered this a little bit today at RT, so I'll go ahead and let you say what details you think are most important here.
Yeah, sure. I can just talk maybe about just like the little aspect that I covered at RT. So the Iranian military actually released a video of this shoot down of this drone, this Northrop Grumman drone. And there's sort of like contention. There's been like a dispute over where this thing was shot down, whether it was over international waters or whether it was over Iranian territory, in Iranian airspace. But it does appear that the drone was shot down over Iranian airspace. Although, as we were talking about earlier off air, this isn't all that important of a distinction because, what is really happening here? We have an American drone over the Persian Gulf. How many thousands of miles away from American airspace? So either way, I think you could, see this as a provocative thing the United States is doing, whether it was over international waters or over, Iranian airspace. But yes, there was a high altitude Navy surveillance drone that was shot down by a Iranian surface to air missile. And sort of there's competing claims. Again, like I said, there's sort of dispute about where this actually happened. But yeah, I think it is like, unlike the previous tanker attacks and stuff, this has been acknowledged. Iran did come out and say, like, we carried the strike out.
Right. Now, the dispute, I guess, right now, between Iran and the U.S. is whether this attack was carried out in international airspace or in Iranian airspace. I guess if the plane was in Iranian airspace by international law, does that make a difference? Or is that just kind of how the lines have been drawn and suddenly that's how they're going to decide on what's right and what's wrong here?
I'm really not sure actually about like the finer points of the international law, but certainly for the Hawks, it makes a much better argument if you can say, hey, we were not over Iranian airspace. This is and this is exactly what they're saying, is it's a unprovoked attack on us because it was over neutral, international waters or something. But again, I would point out that like what international, like where were they actually? What region of the world were they in? And that's very far away from American airspace.
I don't know if you have anything to add here, Stephen.
Yeah, I think if you look at what the Iranian Zarif, they posted some things. They showed some maps and showed that they were over Iran. The U.S. military posted some maps that said they weren't in Iran's airspace. But like Will said, they were there to spy, and it's a surveillance drone. So, it's like, what do you think they're doing over there?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to point out that even if the drone was in Iranian airspace, in the past, Iran has taken control over or somehow manipulate U.S. drones to cause them to change course or go down. And I think this is something that's actually been happening quite a bit over Syria, but not really discussed. The U.S. and Russia trying to take out both each other's cruise missiles and drones with cyber technology of some kind. I really don't understand how to describe it other than they could take down a drone by interfering with the signals and stuff like that. So I suppose it's possible that even if the drone was in Iranian airspace, it could be manipulated there by Iran. Not that the really hots are advocating for that, but I think Will was onto a really important point there at the start that, does it really even matter if the drone was in, Iranian airspace or not? If the drone was surveilling Iran, maybe for military insight on where their missile positions are, if the U.S. was looking to launch a kind of first strike attack against Iran, that would be incredibly important information. I could see why the Iranians would see that as a threat, even if this plane was in international airspace. Well, that should pick it up from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Stephen was right though about Javad Zarif tweeting out the coordinates of this strike. Now, who knows where he got this, what he's basing this on? He didn't present anything beyond the coordinates itself. But if you go look up that coordinates, yep, that is certainly in Iranian territory. So there's that.
Yeah, and you sure would expect. I mean, if with everything going on, and I read something too, Will, that this drone was just sent over there like 5 days ago or so. This isn't something that's been over there a long time. I don't know if I read it on RT or there's somewhere that they said it's something that was just sent over there. So with all the, with everything's going on over there, why did they just send it over there? I mean, it's obvious what they were going to use it for.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that the drone had just been sent over, but I don't find that hard to believe at all with all the recent deployments and stuff. There's all these naval assets being sent over, and there's recently 1,000 ground troops sent. I'm not sure where to exactly, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're sending other equipment there too, including drones.
Yeah, I wonder. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's worth it to talk about the drone that was shot down for a minute here, the Global Hawk, which is a very expensive drone. I think they put the price tag on it at $120 million. Although I guess some senators take some very generous rounding and we're calling it a $200 million U.S. asset in order to try to justify attacks against Iran. So, but it's an expensive drone. I guess they just stuck enough surveillance technology in this drone that's very large. I think it's like in roughly the size of a U.S. airliner, at least in wingspan. I don't know about in total weight and like the, fuselage size, but apparently it's pretty huge and could hover way up there. So, this drone being at 60,000 feet, I think is the number I heard when it was shot down. I guess has some importance on, Iran's capabilities of shooting down, a object that high. I think there was some question as to whether that could be done or not, some people are saying this is a show of force from Iran. So, Stephen, I don't know if you have anything to add about the Global Hawk there.
Question. I wonder how the military was really surprised that they could shoot this down. I wonder if that was just a shock to them. Even, I mean, 60,000 feet is higher than commercial airlines fly usually. So, the fact that Iran could shoot this down, I wonder if that really shocked them.
Yeah, that's sort of why I think the point Kyle had made about potentially the Iranians jammed this thing or made it go off course somehow. Because yeah, you would think the Americans would be sort of aware of where they can fly this thing without it being shot down. But yeah, like you're saying, maybe they were surprised by it, or maybe something went awry and it went further than it was supposed to.
Yeah, that could be too. Yeah, it was certainly a dangerous escalation though. I mean, the whole thing it just seems like it's just incrementally ramping up and ramping up and ramping up.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's the question people really want to hear answers to is kind of where we go from here. Is the U.S. strike the response? The Trump administration, I guess the Trump tweet was, Iran made a very big mistake. It doesn't sound very good, at least from the administration's standpoint, here.
Yeah. You know what? I saw that tweet and I thought that was really worrying. Oh no, made a big mistake. That sounds very blustery. But then I saw other comments that Trump made earlier this afternoon where he actually did say that I can't see that being intentional. I think it was an accident or something. He's trying to downplay it. So it's really confusing with Donald Trump. It's really hard to judge what he's going for because in the same day he'll come out with extremely hawkish, blustery stuff and then he'll walk it back and it's hard to judge what the intention is here.
Yeah, you never know what's in Trump's mind.
Yeah. I mean, the concern is who's around him right now. Bolton and Pompeo seem like real diehard Iran hots. I mean, Bolton throughout his career, but Pompeo, when he was kind of coming up in the Congress and stuff, he was saying some awfully kind of biblical justifications for not liking Iran. So that's kind of scary to me always. One interesting response to this is I kind of just went through Twitter today, I don't know, about 7 p.m. to just kind of see what all the different check marks were saying about this. And while there was, Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, I think he even wrote up an op-ed in the Washington Post that I can't read because of their paywall, but from everybody's responses seemed to suggest it was pretty hawkish. But I saw Bernie Sanders kind of giving a mealy mouth like, oh, Americans don't want more war, not saying going to war with Iran would be really stupid. But, there is a lot of, even like a Tim Kaine I saw saying that it's bizarre that the Trump administration is pushing the Iran arming Al-Qaeda and supporting Al-Qaeda narrative. Of course, you had like the Rand Pauls out there in strong voice, but I even saw Chris Hayes compare what he calls the build-up to war with Iran now to the build-up with the war in Iraq in 2003. And so, I don't know, maybe it's possible that the Trump is so offensive and the Trump administration is going so far that we could actually see a little bit of a left-wing pushback on the war issue again. I mean, that may be kind of an exciting outcome here, because I do think that people generally understand that war with Iran probably wouldn't be that easy and wouldn't be that great, especially when they look at a map and see that Iraq looks really small compared to Iran.
Yeah. Yeah, Iran is a way bigger country, more mountainous, bigger military, like everything about that would be way harder to accomplish than Iraq. And Iraq was not a cakewalk as they said it would be.
Yeah, Iran also talks a lot about their ability to wage asymmetric warfare against, the U.S. should they go to war. So one other thing I kind of wanted to talk about tonight was, I've noticed in the news in recent weeks that there have been some either mortar or rocket fire landing in or near Iraqi bases, not necessarily like in the green zone of Baghdad, but, just out around Iraq. And U.S. forces at times are also in those bases. The articles on these will go on and on about how the U.S. has these tensions with Iran and, different military commanders are worried about this being a tipping point and a concern. And then way down buried in the article, after they talk about the Shia militias and Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas, at the bottom they say, oh yeah, these U.S. troops are deployed here to fight against the Islamic State. It's like, well, isn't that the most likely culprit of the whole thing? But this is concerning to me that if some Americans do die in Iraq, and, it could be somebody in the PMF, it could be one of those Shia militias, because it seems like they're going pretty rogue out there in Iran or in Iraq. Trying to take vengeance against what ISIS did, to the Shiites and all those, who didn't want to convert, but very, very dangerous situation here.
Yeah. I think this is one of the most dangerous tripwires. Because you have like all these militant groups, Sunni militant groups like ISIS active in the area. And I believe it was Pompeo, and I forget when he said this, but he did say that if an American serviceman dies in one of these Iranian strikes, that will be an absolute justification that will trigger an American military response. And so, an ISIS guy shoots a rocket into the green zone or into a Iraqi base, and it kills some contractor or serviceman, then yeah, that's like a very dangerous tripping point or tripwire.
Yeah, that's what I worry about. It just seems like this is. It reminds me of the lead up to World War I. Everything just seems so like it just any little thing can set everybody off in there. And, you think, and Elijah Mangiaro's talked about this a lot about, it's not just Iran, but you've got, they have allies there. They have Syria, they have Hezbollah. I mean, this could wind up in a whole regional thing that could just blow up on them. It's just such a dangerous situation to me.
I always do find that interesting that, people say that, oh, this is Saudi Arabia and Israel pushing this. I don't see this necessarily being all that net of a positive, especially for Israel. If this provokes, larger war and war against Hezbollah and Israel, that won't be good for the Israeli people. Not that, it won't be worse for the people of southern Lebanon, but there's a lot of missiles going to be going off both sides of that border, and it's going to be just bloody and dangerous and disgusting. And I don't know why anyone would want this. You would think every actor in the Middle East would be trying to walk this back from the edge. I mean, Iran has a lot of missiles. You don't think those are going to rain down on Saudi Arabia and their oil infrastructure and all of Mohammed bin Salman's city that they built out in the desert there? And of course, the Emirates will get it too. is absolutely crazy that anybody would want this war.
Yeah, I mean, think about global trade too. Think about how much commerce goes through just the Strait of Hormuz. Like, and even one like Peter Ford, the former ambassador to UK ambassador to Syria, was telling Scott Horton about this. But Peter Ford mentioned that just one or two of these attacks can like jack up insurance rates by a ton, just like the risk of an attack. And so even just a little thing can really disrupt a lot of the global trade and commerce. But a full scale shooting war like that could really, I mean, oil prices, all kinds of stuff could really affect the whole world.
Yeah, I don't know. Israel, I read the Israeli papers a lot just to see what they're saying. And boy, it sometimes seems like they're just egging it on. But I don't think it's going to be a good thing for them, too. I mean, it's just going to kill a lot of people, and they are going to be a target. And then it's going to, it'll break open so wide. If something happens and they start launching rockets, because Israel, the way things are in Saudi Arabia, it just could trigger a huge thing within the whole region. I don't know why anybody there wants that. After all they've gone through in the last 20 years, it just seems like somebody's got to back down here.
Yeah, it does, unfortunately, though, to seem at least some elements within Israel do want this. Like, we've seen, there's at least some reports that the Mossad was passing intelligence to John Bolton, like right after, I think, that first tanker attack in Fujairah or whatever. And so, yeah, I think there are some Israeli elements trying to push this forward. And then also you had that Israeli newspaper, Marev, reporting that the U.S. was planning some tactical strike on Iran. And I just wonder, like, why did they have those sources? Why did the Israeli paper have? I don't know. I just think there is some tie-in with them here for sure.
One interesting thing that I read today was an article in The Hill, and it was about how there's several congressmen now, not just, Rand Paul, Chris Murphy, and Bernie Sanders, but others really looking to exert congressional authority and say, like, kind of no to Donald Trump on war with Iran and saying that, you don't have the authorization to do so. They all seem very concerned that the Trump administration would use the 2001 AUMF to, carry out this attack on Iran because of the alleged connections between Iran and Al-Qaeda, which at the very best seems to be actually just Iran holding a whole bunch of Al-Qaeda members under house arrest and essentially as hostages to make sure that no Al-Qaeda attack Iran, or else, we'll hang all of your members that we have imprisoned in our country. So that doesn't necessarily seem like a state-sponsored terror to me, especially, Will talked about that interview with Scott Horton and Peter Ford, that was out this past weekend. It was part of his, run up to 5,000, episodes there. He talks about how the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks are continuing to arm and support the Al-Qaeda fighters in the Idlib province of Syria. And it's absolutely crazy that Iran still gets labeled to be a state-sponsored terror in all this.
Yeah, it's incredible too that the AUMF that's now nearly 20 years old could justify, like, for this long, could just continue to, keep pushing it forward. It's crazy.
Well, yeah.
That interview with Peter Ford was good. One of the things I didn't realize too is that he talked about is how Qatar is involved in all that too. More so, he says, in Saudi Arabia even now, in Syria. And there's so many different actors here all playing against each other. It's just amazing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Middle East is a crazy place where you now have the, small little peninsula country of Qatar that hangs off of the, massive Saudi state, essentially withholding a blockade from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE. And they've kind of drifted more towards Turkey, and that has also kind of put them more in the orbit of Iran. And this has created a situation where the Qataris and the Turks are supporting the Al-Qaeda fighters in Idlib, Syria. And that's not really the policy of Saudi Arabia anymore. They're only doing it a little bit. The Middle East is an absolutely insane place. And, one quote from Vladimir Putin that I thought was, extremely insightful was, what he said Ariel Sharon said to him, which is, anybody in this region of the world will lie to you for any reason. And I was like, all right, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I really do keep that in mind every time I read any kind of Israeli news. Cause even if you think, well, or not Israeli, any Middle Eastern news, looking at even what Al Jazeera writes, you think, well, that's against interest, but there's usually some kind of reason that you don't understand about, this is a little difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and Wahhabist. And so in this case, the Qataris don't support the more jihadist factions or whatever the hell. It gets quite confusing. Oh, I thought a good topic would be the new acting Secretary of Defense. Patrick Shanahan is out after the FBI put out some information, or I think it was the FBI kind of dug up a domestic violence situation. I'm not sure on all the details. The story to I understand it was that him and his wife hit each other. The cops were called, and that's what happened. And that's what at least they used as an excuse to get rid of Patrick Shanahan. In recent weeks, I've read that he's been bullied around by John Bolton, and Bolton has stuck all of his little spies and, kind of, minions around either Pentagon or, just, in the ranks of the Army, kind of staff or whatever, and is really manipulating some of the information coming up through there and is aware of everything the Pentagon is going to put out. So I guess that's been problematic. But Shanahan's out now, and he made this guy, Mark Espin, who I believe started as infantry in the Army and ends up on the executive board of Raytheon as a vice president. So that's a pretty extreme change. The only other thing I really know about him is that he's a China hawk. Will, I don't know if you have anything that you think about this whole change in defense, Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, a couple things. First, yes, you are right that it was during an FBI background check, I think, for Shanahan that they dug up this domestic violence stuff. But one thing that I actually read that I'm not totally sure how valid this is, but somebody had said that Pompeo visited, I think, a military base in Florida or something, and that this really angered Shanahan. That Shanahan thought that Pompeo's trying to do an end run around me. He doesn't respect my authority. Why is the Secretary of State going to, visit these military guys? And some people thought it was to try to convince and persuade them that we should do this thing in Iran. And that maybe some people are saying this is maybe why Shanahan, decided to, there was the whole domestic violence thing, but I think they could have brushed that off if they really wanted to. I think he was using that as a reason to leave. However, I don't actually know, I basically know nothing about the new, SecDef. I know that, like you said, Kyle, he's some kind of Raytheon guy. I saw some people saying that, we just went for, the Department of Defense just went from Boeing to Raytheon. But otherwise, yeah, I still got to read about this guy.
Yeah, I heard the same thing. It just seems all those guys that come from private industry are going to get rolled by Pompeo and Bolton. They've been in the bureaucracy. They know how to work the bureaucracy. And these guys are coming from the outside. I just think Pompeo and Bolton are going to roll them. They just know, they know the ins and outs and how to maneuver, especially Bolton. From everything I've read about Bolton, he is like a master at navigating the bureaucracy and getting things his way.
One thing that I guess I was encouraged about was it seemed to me that Shanahan had been made irrelevant. And if we're going to prevent a war here with Iran, I think the voice of the Army, and CENTCOM is going to have to be strong because they know they'll be the ones dying in that war. And there's 70,000 U.S. troops in the region, within range of Iranian missiles now. These are the people that are going to stand up and say, no, we're not going to die for it. And hopefully this guy is a little bit stronger of a leader and, won't let, Bolton, who, we know will go and chew people out and threaten the OPCW's children. Isn't that right? He, said we know where your children go to school. This guy will do anything to get his way, and having a strong figure, I think Mattis was probably actually helpful on the Iran issue. Shanahan has, really seemed to me like a total waste. Maybe he made some extra sales to Boeing and helped them out at a time their stock should have been plummeting, for their whole 737 fiasco. But he got them 80 new F-15 SSs, $80 million a pop. So, they end up doing all right because of him. But at the same time, I'm sure this new guy isn't going to be much better.
Isn't it weird that we're expecting the military guys to be the voice of reason?
It seems to be a trend somehow. The civilian leadership are just mad bombers, and the military sometimes are a little more restrained, I guess.
Right. It depends on what war it comes down to, but certainly, this seems to be something that Scott Horton has pointed out many times, is that in the lead up, to, Bush's push for war with Iran, it was, Admiral Fallon at the time who kind of stood up and said, no, we're not going to do this. So on Iran, we had to rely on the military.
Crazy.
There were a couple stories today I saw about Congress now stepping up and voting against Trump's weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE that he did through the national emergency. I think 7 Republicans went along with all the Democrats. So that still puts them, short of a veto-proof thing there, but it's somewhat of a stand against the president's policy. And I'm not sure. Will, did you see this? Were you encouraged by this?
Yeah. I don't recall every detail. I'd have to go back to, refresh myself. But I do recall seeing 22 resolutions passed in the Senate. And so I think Trump is expected to veto whatever passed here, but I think it's cool. It's setting up some kind of showdown. At least there's some pressure. There's some movement. I guess it's better than a total bipartisan consensus on the thing,
Right.
Yeah,
and
it's too bad it wasn't a veto proof, but I did see Rand Paul did a speech on the Senate that's pretty good about it. I don't know if you guys saw that Rand did there.
I'll have to go watch that.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And so it's nice to see some, they just got to keep building it and hope more people sign on to it.
Yeah, right. Well, you would hope that even if, some of these congressmen will never care about Yemeni people dying and being exploded by U.S. bombs because of Saudi Arabia's ridiculous war in that country, maybe they would just care about Trump encroaching on their power and think, well, do we really want the president to be able to veto, a congressional override of his national emergency declaration to sell weapons to a country that he knew Congress wouldn't approve of in the first place? It seems like maybe like they would feel like, Trump's getting a little too power hungry, encroaching a little bit too much on our territory there. I doubt Mitch McConnell's the man that's going to stand up for that, but not that I really ever count on the constitutional thing to really prevent any wars. But a lot of times I guess, I hope that this is maybe the thing that will roll it back a little bit or help a little bit.
Yeah, what was McConnell's big thing? I think he was upset about Khashoggi. I think he was like, you can't dismember somebody in an embassy. I think that's like what really got him going. And so that I think was a turning point for a lot of these lawmakers.
I don't know about McConnell, but I know that was Lindsey Graham's thing because he's suddenly good on this one, shocking as it is.
Yeah, I think that's what Rand Paul was talking about too today, the Khashoggi thing.
Yeah, it's a interesting one that I guess because he did work for the Washington Post that the Washington Post cared. And so then Congress cared. But, even today I was looking at the UN has this, nice, well, not nice picture. It's kind of, very sad, but it's a high quality photo of a, good looking Yemeni kid, like, having to like go rely on the UN for food aid and everything like that. And it's never going to be that girl's life that, changes any of their minds. It's always, I guess, going to be somebody tied to the Washington Post, but I don't know. The war in Yemen really depresses me, trying to figure out how it's been going on, how terrible it's been for so long, and just how everything they could use to justify it they do, including making up the whole fake narrative about the Houthis being Iranian proxies and all that other stuff. And I don't know, Will, if you have anything to say about Yemen, if you've covered that at all this week. I hear the cholera outbreak there is getting pretty severe again. Of course, in the past, they've just totaled up all the cases of like vomiting and diarrhea as cholera. But at least those cases are on the rise, whether it's cholera or some other kind of virus. We've already had 1,100 people dead, in 2019.
Yeah, I think on Yemen, like out of all the ongoing conflicts, all the wars, all the interventions going on right now, I think like our movement, the broader, non-interventionist anti-war movement or whatever, I think on Yemen, we've been perhaps the most effective. I mean, just today you saw the UK, a court decision. I don't think it actually had any binding implication. I think they just said, please review this and look at this again, make sure you're doing the right thing here. In terms of arming Saudi Arabia. And then also Germany has some arms export bans. There have been, activist like initiatives to block cargo in France and Spain. I think in Italy, there was, dock workers, trade unionists, excuse me. So yeah, I think on Yemen, there's been actually like the anti-war movement, the forces of non-intervention or something have actually accomplished something there. And I think that's something to be proud of.
Yeah, that war is the worst. It's just so hard to see what's going on there. to look at that. But, you know, I saw something on Nasser Arabi's, and he was on Al Jazeera arguing with somebody, but he made a good point. He was talking about how they're always talking about how, you know, the Houthis are proxies of Iran. And he said, you know, we don't care about this international stuff. We're fighting for our own survival here. You know, they're bombing us, they're killing us, and all this international intrigue with Iran and stuff is really not our business. We're fighting for our survival, and the Houthis are fighting for the survival of Yemen, and that's what we care about. And I think he's right about that. You know, you can't look at that and say that's not what they're doing. You know, why would they care about what's going on with everything else in the world, with what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, we see a map, you know, we see Yemen, we see this big bird's eye view, but they're there. It's their home and stuff. So it's not all geopolitics to them. They're fighting a war for survival, for sure.
Right. And now ACLED has documented 91,000 deaths from that war since 2015. Yeah. Of course, I think Save the Children puts out the number like one child dies every 12 minutes of a preventable reason in Yemen at this time. And, you know, that's not only the air war being waged with U.S. bombs and U.S. and U.K. planes, but also enforced by the U.S. Navy and the Navy that's been given to Saudi Arabia by Western countries. That's absolutely plaguing Yemen. So that ACLED stat I wanted to mention, and I also wanted to point out that there has been some threats and problems between the UN World Food Program and the Houthis around this biometric system that the UN wants to have all the data for, and the Houthis refuse to. I don't necessarily understand why, and maybe somebody, an aid worker or Nasser Arabi would be better able to explain either the Houthi position or why the UN demands that data. But they're now threatening to cut off food or reduce food going to the Houthi areas of Yemen. And I have to imagine that would be catastrophic at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, 22 million people who are completely reliant on some form of humanitarian aid. Yeah, I'm curious. I would like to know more about like the biometric thing. I know the WPF, the World Food Program, has threatened the Houthis before to withdraw their aid or something, but it wasn't because of the biometrics. It was because there was like theft of resources or goods were being diverted or something like that. Some of the aid was being stolen. I think there were other outstanding issues like that, but yeah, it's interesting, the whole biometrics.
Now,
that's
at the same
saddest war, that is just, I can see the Houthis, you know, with everything going on there, that there's some problems with them. There's so many different groups.
Sure.
And, you know, maybe they want the food for their areas and their people. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, I just operate under the assumption that like any like aid program operating in a conflict zone where there's, you know, all kinds of militant groups, like they would probably expect some degree of theft and some, you know, a couple boxes of food to be made off with. You would not like, it strikes me as very sort of like petty, or I don't know, to threaten to withhold the food aid because the Houthis aren't behaving the way you want them to. I don't know. It just seems very like petty.
Yeah, I'd agree with you that you got to expect that, and people just stealing it to sell it on the black market, you know, to make some money. I mean, that's just the way it's going to be in any war area.
They live in abject poverty. Yemen is the poorest country in the region. It was before the war, and now I don't even know how do you characterize that? If it was already the poorest country, what is it now?
It's a poorest country, and I saw somebody say, or a study done to say it's been set back 20 years. So whatever that means, how the poorest country 20 years ago is what Yemen is now with all the destruction on their infrastructure. I've also seen, and it's kind of interesting that this is also kind of a different arm of the UN, but the part of the UN that's helping to enforce the Stockholm Accord in Yemen says that the Houthis have given up the Port of Hodeidah and haven't been there for a month. Now, from my understanding, they handed it over to the Coast Guard. That seems to me to be loyal to the Houthis, and from all the reporting I've read, that's the case. Maybe I'm wrong and they're a little bit more autonomous than just relying on the Houthis. But it's interesting that the UN is seeming to bat the Houthis' play here to say that, no, we've given up the port and now you gotta like start rolling in food like you promised.
Yeah, I mean, given like what we were just talking about with the WPF, like given that they're willing, the UN, at least some UN agencies are willing to say, hey, Houthis, like, you know, willing to give them orders or whatever. You would think that if the UN was suspicious that the Coast Guard or whatever was the Houthis, that they would call that out. And so, I don't know, maybe maybe they're unaware of this or something, but yeah, that does seem like a good sign that they're not saying, hey, the Houthis aren't actually giving up the port.
Yeah, you have this picture of the Coast Guard, like our Coast Guard, but I can't imagine the Yemi Coast Guard is, a couple guys in speedboats or something.
Right. I think there's like 2 patrol boats and then like a bunch of fiberglass speedboats, and that's supposed to be their capabilities.
Fishing boats or something,
Right. And how's that chain of command work too? I mean, like what militias are running that thing? Is it how organized?
Exactly.
Apparently at least according to Nasser Arabi, when I asked him, the command structure is the same from before the war. So I don't know if the Coast Guard somehow been, or for whatever international reason, I know like they're called the white ships. And so I think they have like different kind of rules that they get to follow. And so maybe they've been able to avoid some of the carnage of the war or something like, I don't understand it all, but that's what it seems like. A couple other things I have on my list here was I thought there was an interesting story. I think I read it in the NPR website saying that 380 Venezuelan migrants have died. And it was interesting because they did place some blame on the Trump administration. Now they kind of took the angle of this was the Trump administration's fault for having a stricter border policy, but not really that the Trump administration is creating conditions in Venezuela so terrible that the people are fleeing the country. I don't know. I guess in one sense it's even worse that not only is the Trump administration starving them to death in their own country, but he won't let them flee to our own. I guess that's a little bit more of a problem, but at the same time, I think there's a shocking lack of focus on the U.S. sanctions being a real problem with what's happening in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, you have like the economic conditions are driving a lot of like migration out of the country, a lot of emigration. Is that what you call it when it's out? But yeah, so the economy is like largely to blame here. However, if you look at the sanctions and what effects those are having on the economy and they do have sort of a highly stated socialist system where people are sort of reliant on some of the services. And so when their state revenues get huge hits because of the sanctions on oil, then yeah, you're going to have a lot of like people who are destitute and people who are desperate who flee.
Did those people die in Venezuela, Kyle, or trying to get to our country, or?
There was a breakdown in the article. A lot died in Mexico. A majority, or at least a plurality of the 380 died in Mexico. There was something like 20 to 30 that died within Venezuela. Some in Brazil. I think a few in Peru. And then quite a few also in just different areas between Panama and the southern Mexican border. But a good number were killed in Mexico, and I'm assuming that was by whoever the human traffickers were, the smugglers were in those cases.
Oh, were they trying to get to the U.S.? Do you know?
That's the way the article made it seem. I mean, at the same time, like, I'm sure they didn't go interview the families and say, hey, were you looking to settle in Tijuana or San Diego? Yeah, but I thought that was interesting. I also saw that the Peruvian government was cracking down on their border. They used to let just Venezuelans cross. Now they're going to demand that Venezuelans have passports to cross. And I guess it's really hard to get a passport in Venezuela. So that's supposed to slow down the immigration there. They say there's already 8,000 Venezuelans living in Peru.
This is a little bit off topic, but it is connected to Venezuela. Did you guys see the story about the embezzlement of humanitarian aid? There was that Live Aid concert that Richard Bronson put on in Cucuta, right over in Colombia. And Cucuta is like that border town where all like the defector soldiers are amassing. And yeah, a couple of Guaido's guys embezzled like hundreds of thousands of dollars in aid money. Meanwhile, there's like this huge international push that focuses on aid and says, oh, they're not letting aid in. Maduro's, blaming it all on Maduro. And I just find it interesting that meanwhile, Guaido's guys are embezzling this stuff and blowing it in nightclubs and on Gucci clothes and like that. Crazy.
You weigh in on this if you want, Stephen.
I did read something that, I don't remember where, but that Trump like blew up at Bolton on this at some meeting or somewhere, and that, this whole Venezuela thing.
Good. I want blood between them.
I hope so. Yeah.
Well, this is the real problem I see in Venezuela and Iran is that Trump's going to have to somehow look like he's backing off. And I know Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And tomorrow he could say, oh, I accomplished all I wanted with my sanctions in Venezuela. but it's really not true. If he says it, it's not the case that he got what he wanted, same with Iran. So I don't see really where he ends up backing off and just getting rid of the sanctions. At the same time, if the sanctions stay on, I guess unless the Trump administration just kind of quietly starts, letting companies trade with Venezuela without putting in Iran without putting secondary sanctions on. Maybe that's the way it happened, but I just don't see a way for them to walk back down off the ledge they're on right now. And I guess, we're a year and a half away from an election. I guess that I think it would be counterproductive to Trump to try to start a war right now, especially since he ran all that America First foreign policy. But I don't know, Will, if you see any path to really back down from either the conflict with Venezuela or Iran.
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing that. I think one of the huge problems with Trump's sort of strategy or his template or whatever of these maximum pressure campaigns is, like you said, he really does kind of hem himself in. He kind of puts himself into a corner, and he can only escalate without looking like a pansy or a chump or whatever on the world stage from, Trump's perspective. And so he's surrounded himself with all these hawks, and I think he's under the impression that he's going to be able to bluster and make threats and pretend to escalate stuff and get what he wants and get a deal or get negotiation, like kind of what happened with North Korea a little bit. Like, there was threats and then eventually there were talks. However, I don't know if that's always going to happen. I think the people he's surrounded himself with are much more committed to actually, getting into these conflicts. And so, yeah, I don't see how he can back down from this stuff. But yeah, certainly hope he does.
I think he could back down from Venezuela. I think, like you just said, Kyle, just ignore it for a while and kind of let it die down and start, but Iran is one. I think Will's right. He's just backed himself into such a corner right now. I mean, I was listening to Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul today, and Daniel had said one of the things he could do is just start giving a few of these countries some, relief from the sanctions. And slowly do that as a gesture to Iran to say, okay, we're doing it, because I don't think they trust whatever he says. They don't trust him, and we certainly don't trust Iran. But if he could just say, hey, okay, I'll give a few countries some relief from these sanctions, let them buy some oil from you, I'm showing some good faith, let's get to the negotiating table. Maybe that's something that would work. But Venezuela, I think he could probably just, kind of let that one die off, and people wouldn't make a big deal. But Iran, it's a different story to me.
Yeah, maybe that's the hope on Venezuela. I will say that, when the whole North Korea thing was starting to go right finally, and Trump was taking credit, I was, one of the people that was like, fine, let Donald Trump take credit. If he puts his name on it, maybe he'll work really hard for Korean peace. But the one downside to that is he's going to think his maximum pressure campaign worked, and he's going to try it out elsewhere. And we've seen that, and it didn't work in North Korea. It was a lot of other, factors going on, like, Kim Jong-un having achieved something of a nuclear deterrence and being ready to talk, having a willing partner in South Korea, and not necessarily for any reason other than the, previous leader of the country was more conservative and hawkish towards North Korea, but she was extremely corrupt. So corrupt she ends up going to jail. And so kind of just like you would have in the United States if you have a really corrupt president in one party, like a Richard Nixon who has to leave office, typically the voters are going to go the other way the next time. And that's what they did. They went the other way, left wing. And it just happened to be, the man up was Moon Jae-in, who's a true believer in Korean peace. And I think he has like some ancestry of North Korean descent. So he understands, that the Korean people are all in it together. And the way to best help the North Korean people isn't through hostility, but through peaceful action. But, try explaining that to Donald Trump, all that nuance and all that technical detail when, he's just happy to hear that, oh, yes, Mr. President, you did the right thing, and North Korea and Kim Jong-un are coming begging to you on their knees. And maybe that's why he ends up following Bolton at Hanoi and making the mistakes he did. But boy, is this maximum pressure campaign not working anywhere else. We're kind of getting close here on time, so I'll let both of you, Stephen, you could go first. Anything finally you have to say wrapping up here?
I'm just
thanks so much for coming
guys.
on.
Oh, I'm just curious with you guys politically, what do you think happened if Trump ramps it up with Iran? Do you think that's politically a positive for him or a negative for him, domestically, politically?
It's hard. It's kind of hard to say, I think, because like with his own base, I think they're just gonna. I don't know. I stopped myself because some of the people who supported him, like Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson, who did support Trump, have sort of backed off a little bit because of some of the war stuff. I think it was after Syria that Carlson said, like, forget this guy, or he was, fed up with him. Now, his rank and file base, though, I think often, like, they're just going to rah-rah and support whatever he does. But then on the other side, too, you have his opposition, who I'm not sure if they're really, like, dependent on the issues either. I think they're just going to oppose him regardless either. So there's, like, people on the margins who are more independently minded. But yeah, I mean, I would sure hope that if he starts a war with Iran, that certainly hurts him real bad politically. But I can't say that for sure, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, at least my heart really says that would hurt him politically, and maybe this is just, ignoring my brain, because boy, would it be the worst thing ever if he uses a war with Iran to rally for re-election, and how dangerous that President Trump would be, a second-term war president. But, I really do think that it would probably trigger a pretty hard anti-war movement on the left. I think there's probably going to be enough veteran dissenting voices that it may be pretty uncomfortable for the Trump administration to have to constantly talk down and condemn soldiers and make them, and kind of, the way Trump makes anybody who disagrees with him the enemy, probably wouldn't fly very well if, his enemies at the time are different American soldiers. I mean, you're certainly going to see, Basevich and McGregor and Danny Surgeon and the rest of those guys, Daniel Davis, all out there trumpeting that this war with Iran is absolutely stupid. The president must have lost his mind. This isn't an American first policy whatsoever. And I don't know. I really do believe, that polling data that shows that Hillary Clinton did the worst in, different counties that were, the ones heavily impacted, by losses of the Iraq war. And if that's really the case, then, maybe that would be something that really would hurt Trump going into 2020. I certainly don't think that's what the American people want as a whole. I really hope that's the case, that they really don't want war and realize that, what we need to do now is just, avoid it at all costs and somehow start to bring some troops home and spend less money on war. But boy, does the war budget keep going up under Trump anyways. And that seems to be a selling point. So conservatives are not conservatives, because some conservatives are all right, but Republicans, the general Republican base is absolutely insane. And their foreign policy and just general view on everything doesn't make sense, about as much sense as the Democrats, I suppose. But yeah, so anyways, thanks so much for joining. I'll try to do these at the very least once a month if they go well. I mean, tonight was a lot of fun. Maybe I could get them up more often. I will try to run them as episodes of the show so long as, the content's good like it was tonight. And I appreciate both Will and Steven for coming on. And, find all of our work at the Libertarian Institute. And Will is a staff writer at RT. His name isn't on all of his articles, but he tweets them out and puts them on his Facebook page. So you can always find Will's work, if you follow him on social media.
Yeah. Thanks for having us on. And it was really nice to meet you, Steve. And I'm glad we got to kind of talk and hang out for a bit.
Yeah. It's good to meet you guys. And I really appreciate both of you guys' work. You guys are really doing some good work, and